It was a bright Saturday morning when the quiet hum of traffic on Willow Creek Road mixed with the distant sound of lawnmowers and sprinklers. The sun reflected off the polished roofs of identical houses lined behind tall hedges and white fences. At the entrance to the gated community of Silver Maple Estates stood a single metal gate, silver and clean, guarded by a man named Rick. He had worked this job for 4 years and believed the gate was his kingdom. He wore dark glasses, a tight shirt that showed the outline of his belly, and carried a radio as if it were a badge of power. Nothing irritated him more than people who did not follow the rules. So when a dark-colored sedan pulled up that morning, spotless and elegant, his expression hardened. Behind the wheel sat a woman who looked calm, collected, almost too calm for someone he didn't recognize. She rolled down the window, the soft mechanical sound breaking the silence. Her voice was polite. "Good morning. I have an appointment with the HOA board." Rick squinted at her name badge clipped to her navy blue blazer. "This is a private community. Visitors must be pre-approved. What's your name?" She replied quietly, "Dr. Vanessa Cole." Rick frowned, pretending to check his clipboard even though he knew he had no such list. "Don't see you here. Maybe you've got the wrong neighborhood." Vanessa smiled faintly, the kind of patient smile used by people who are used to being underestimated. "No, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Rick leaned down, resting both arms on her window frame. "I'm going to need you to wait here. You can't just drive in. We've had some issues lately. People pretending to be officials." A line of cars began forming behind her, engines idling, horns starting to honk. Vanessa remained silent, her eyes steady, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel. She didn't raise her voice or argue. She simply said, "You can call whoever you need to call." Rick straightened up, annoyed by her calmness. "Yeah, I'll do that," he muttered into his radio, calling for backup even though there was no emergency. 2 more guards appeared from the small booth, both younger, both eager to prove themselves. One of them, a red-haired man with a nervous twitch, whispered, "What's going on, Rick?" Rick replied loudly enough for her to hear, "Just making sure this lady isn't trying to sneak in. Claims she's got business with the HOA." The younger guard nodded, trying to look tough. Inside her car, Vanessa glanced at the clock. She had arrived exactly on time, 9 a.m. sharp, as planned. She sighed quietly and looked ahead through the gate where she could see manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and a clubhouse with white columns at the end of the main street. To most people, Silver Maple Estates looked peaceful, even perfect, but she knew appearances often hid something uglier. She had seen neighborhoods like this before, communities run by small-minded people with too much control and too little compassion. She had come here for a reason, one that none of these guards could imagine. Rick tapped the side of her car window again. "Step out of the vehicle, please." Vanessa turned her head slowly. "Is there a reason?" He shrugged. "Protocol." She studied his posture, legs wide, chest puffed, hand on his belt as if he wore a gun instead of a walkie-talkie. She unbuckled her seat belt, opened the door, and stepped out. Her shoes clicked softly on the pavement. She stood straight, her chin level, her gaze calm. The sun caught the faint gold trim on her badge clipped to her blazer. Rick noticed but pretended not to. "I'll need to see your ID," he said. She handed it to him without hesitation. It was an official federal identification card, but he barely glanced at it. "You could have printed this online," he scoffed. Behind her, the line of cars grew longer. A woman in a convertible shouted, "Can you hurry it up? I'm late for yoga." Another driver leaned on his horn. Rick waved them off. He said to Vanessa. "I'm going to have to call the HOA president. Nobody told me about this." Vanessa replied evenly, "Do what you need to do." Her voice was neither angry nor afraid. It carried a quiet authority that made the younger guards exchange uncertain glances. One whispered, "Rick, maybe she's telling the truth." Rick glared. "Don't tell me how to do my job." He raised his radio again. "Control, this is Gate 1. Got a woman here claiming to be a doctor or something. Says she's here for the board." Need confirmation. Static filled the air. Then a voice crackled back. No record of visitors scheduled this morning. Rick smirked. You hear that? No record. Vanessa looked at him, her tone still calm. Maybe you should check under Cole. Dr. Vanessa Cole. He repeated the name over the radio. Silence. Then the voice again, negative, no listing. Rick folded his arms, satisfied. Told you. You'll have to turn around. For the first time, Vanessa's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not fear, just disappointment. She reached into her blazer pocket, slowly enough not to startle anyone, and pulled out her phone. You may want to stand back, she said softly. Rick frowned. Excuse me. She pressed one button and held the phone to her ear. This is Agent Cole, she said in a measured tone. I've arrived at Silver Maple Estates for the scheduled compliance review, but I'm being detained at the gate by private security. Could you confirm authorization? The guards looked at one another. A voice answered on speaker, deep, official, and clear. Copy that, Agent Cole. Stand by. The HOA board has been informed and is awaiting your arrival at the clubhouse. We're dispatching oversight personnel to your location now. Rick's mouth fell open slightly. The younger guards stepped back. For a moment, no one spoke. Then one of them whispered, She's legit. Rick swallowed hard. He tried to recover his authority. You should have told us earlier. Vanessa turned off her phone and looked at him. I did. You just didn't listen. She walked back to her car, opened the door, and waited. The guards hesitated before pressing the button to open the gate. The metal bars slid aside with a slow mechanical groan. As she drove past, Rick stood stiffly, unsure whether to apologize or salute. She didn't look back. Her car glided through the neighborhood like a shadow moving under bright light. Inside the community, residents had already started whispering. A woman watering her flowers paused to stare. Two joggers slowed down, curious. A man trimming his hedges muttered, She doesn't look like one of us. Vanessa drove calmly, her eyes scanning every house. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. The lawns were identical, the fences measured, the mailboxes freshly painted. Yet something about the silence felt heavy, like a neighborhood that smiled too much in public but hid its cruelty behind closed doors. As she reached the clubhouse, she saw 3 black SUVs parked out front. Men and women in dark suits stood near the entrance, holding files and clipboards. One of them spotted her and gave a small nod. She parked, stepped out, and adjusted her blazer. The air smelled faintly of pine and chlorine from the nearby pool. She could already feel eyes watching her from the windows inside. Rick had followed in his golf cart, trying to explain himself to one of the suited officials who ignored him completely. Vanessa didn't even glance his way. She climbed the steps to the clubhouse, her heels tapping softly against the stone. Inside, through the glass doors, she could see the HOA board gathered around a polished oak table. 5 people dressed like they were attending a small-town government meeting. At the head sat Karen Holbrook, the HOA president, a woman with sharp eyes and a habit of smiling only when others were watching. Karen whispered something to the man beside her, and all eyes turned toward the door. The moment Vanessa entered, the room went silent. The ticking of the wall clock became painfully loud. Karen stood and forced a smile. Dr. Cole, I presume, she said. We weren't expecting you so soon. Vanessa closed the door behind her and replied evenly, Your security delayed me. Karen's smile twitched. I see. Miscommunication. I'm sure. Please, have a seat. Vanessa sat, placing a leather folder on the table. This meeting will be recorded for documentation. I'm here to conduct a state compliance audit under the Community Oversight Act. You've been notified twice, but it seems there was confusion. Karen's face tightened slightly. Audit? There must be some mistake. We handle everything internally. Vanessa opened her folder. Internal handling is exactly what we're reviewing. Outside, through the glass wall, the security guards stood uneasily by the SUVs. Residents had begun gathering near the fence, whispering about the mysterious woman who had made the guards look like amateurs. Inside, Karen tried to regain control. Perhaps this can wait. We're in the middle of our homeowner policy review. Vanessa looked at her calmly. That's precisely what I'm here for. There have been multiple complaints filed against your board. Unlawful fines, selective enforcement, and discriminatory actions against residents. My office has been assigned to investigate. The air in the room grew tense. One board member, an older man with a red face, blurted out, "Who filed these complaints? People always whine when they don't like the rules." Vanessa turned her gaze toward him, steady and unblinking. "The names are confidential. What matters are the facts." She began laying out documents, printed photos of letters, bank statements, and reports of violations. This community has issued 72 fines in 6 months. 48 of those were directed at minority homeowners or single parents. That ratio suggests bias, not coincidence. Karen's smile vanished completely. "We apply the same rules to everyone," she said tightly. "Maybe certain people just have more trouble following them." Vanessa raised her eyes slowly. "Is that your official statement?" Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. No one else spoke. The room felt heavy, like air before a storm. Outside, Rick stood near the door, trying to listen through the glass. His earlier confidence had vanished. The younger guard whispered, "Man, we really messed up, huh?" Rick sighed. "Yeah, big time." Inside, Vanessa continued calmly. "We'll be examining all financial records, communication logs, and enforcement procedures. I'll also be speaking with residents privately. Cooperation is expected. Interference will be treated as obstruction of investigation." Karen tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. "You make it sound like we're criminals." Vanessa met her gaze. "If you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to worry about." The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes before Vanessa stood, gathering her papers. "I'll return tomorrow with my full team. Please ensure all documents are accessible." She turned to leave. Karen called after her, "Dr. Cole, surely this isn't necessary. Our HOA has a reputation to protect." Vanessa paused at the door, looked back, and said softly, "That's what every HOA president says right before the truth comes out." Then she stepped outside. The guards straightened as she passed. The residents watching from their porches grew quiet, sensing something big was unfolding. The wind rustled the flags on the clubhouse roof. The neighborhood, so proud of its perfect image, felt suddenly fragile. Vanessa walked toward her car, her face unreadable, her steps steady. She opened the door, sat down, and took one last look at the gated entrance where it had all started. Rick was still there, standing by his booth, staring at the ground. When he saw her glance his way, he lifted his hand in a hesitant half-salute. She didn't return it, but she nodded once, just enough to show that she had noticed. Then she started the engine and drove off slowly, her car disappearing beyond the bend lined with trimmed hedges. For the first time since he started working at Silver Maple Estates, Rick felt something new: shame. He had seen people come and go, yelled at delivery drivers, hassled visiting relatives, even written tickets for parked cars. But never before had someone looked him in the eye the way she did, calm, certain, unafraid. He knew this woman wasn't just another visitor. She was someone who carried truth the way others carried weapons, quietly, but with power. Inside the clubhouse, Karen sat frozen in her chair while the rest of the board whispered nervously. One finally asked, "What are we going to do?" Karen didn't answer. She just stared at the documents Vanessa had left behind. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawns. The perfect image of Silver Maple Estates was beginning to crack. And somewhere down the road, in the quiet hum of her car, Dr. Vanessa Cole drove toward the city, the golden light glinting off her badge. She had seen neighborhoods like this before, small empires run by people who thought rules made them gods. But she also knew something else. Sooner or later, every empire forgets who really holds the power. She whispered under her breath, Let's see what secrets you're hiding, Silver Maple. The radio on her dashboard crackled softly. A voice came through. Agent Cole, everything in order? She replied, yes, but they don't know what's coming. As she drove past the open fields toward the horizon, the sky turned orange and calm, but inside those perfect white fences behind her, unease had already taken root. 4 years, the residents of that community had feared the HOA. Soon, the HOA would learn what fear felt like. And it had started, not with shouting or force, but with a woman in a blue suit, standing at a gate, patient and unshaken, the calm before the storm. The sun was lowering when Dr. Vanessa Cole turned her car out of Silver Maple Estates and onto the open road, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound inside the vehicle. Her reflection in the window looked calm, but her mind was still circling the memory of the gate. The way the guard's words had cut through the air. You people always think you can walk in here. She had heard that tone before, not once, but in every town where she had uncovered arrogance disguised as order. It was the same tone that came from people who thought they owned the world because they owned a fence. As she drove, she thought about the residents behind those iron gates, the families who had written letters begging the state to step in. Some said they were being fined for painting their doors the wrong color. Others said they were being followed by private patrol cars for having too many visitors. But the worst reports had one thing in common: intimidation of anyone who didn't fit the neighborhood image. She had seen those words before. They always meant the same thing. Back inside Silver Maple, the community that had looked so perfect an hour ago was suddenly uneasy. Rick was still at the gatehouse, staring at the empty road where her car had vanished. The other guards had gone quiet. Nobody wanted to talk about what had happened, but every one of them felt the same cold knot in their stomachs. They all knew they had crossed a line. Rick leaned on the counter, his hands shaking slightly. He told himself it wasn't his fault. She hadn't looked like someone important, and nobody told him about any audit. Still, no matter how many excuses he whispered, they didn't sound convincing anymore. He lit a cigarette, even though it was against HOA policy, and exhaled slowly, watching the smoke curl up toward the ceiling. The air felt heavy, like the calm after lightning. A few blocks away, inside the clubhouse, Karen Holbrook slammed a file shut. I don't believe this, she snapped. Who does she think she is, showing up unannounced like that? Her voice echoed in the empty hall. The other board members looked at her nervously. One tried to speak. Maybe we should call legal. Legal won't help us, Karen interrupted. If she's state oversight, she has full authority. But this feels like a setup. She stood by the window, pulling the curtain aside to look out toward the gate. Rick said she flashed some kind of badge. Could be fake. Another board member, a thin man with silver hair, spoke carefully. Karen, if that badge was fake, why would her call connect to an actual oversight officer? He heard the voice. That doesn't happen by accident. Karen turned sharply, glaring. Then why weren't we told about the audit? Someone must have leaked those complaints. I want names. Outside, night had settled over the rows of perfect houses, their porch lights blinking on one by one. Inside, behind the drawn curtains, whispers started. Neighbors called each other, gossip spreading like wildfire. Did you hear about that woman at the gate? Security stopped someone important. I heard she's from the state. The HOA's in trouble. Each version grew louder, faster, more dramatic. Within an hour, the entire community was buzzing with half-truths and nervous speculation. By the time Rick locked up the booth for the night, his phone had already blown up with messages. The security chat group was flooded with jokes that didn't sound funny anymore. Nice job, Rick, detaining a government agent. Hope you like unemployment. He turned the phone face down and rubbed his forehead. The glowing light from the guardhouse window reflected his tired face. He knew tomorrow would be worse. Meanwhile, in a small apartment across town, Vanessa sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reviewing files spread out in front of her. The clock ticked softly. She wasn't angry about what had happened. Not really. She was used to being underestimated. It happened so often that she had learned to turn other people's arrogance into her advantage. Still, the way Rick had looked at her, the dismissive tone, the assumption that she didn't belong, it lingered. She thought about the residents again. If this was how the security treated someone like her, what chance did an ordinary homeowner have? She closed the file and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The next day would be different. The next day, she wouldn't walk in alone. The following morning dawned gray and heavy. Rain clouds hovered low over the city, turning the streets slick and reflective. At exactly 8:30, 3 black SUVs rolled out of the government office parking lot, heading towards Silver Maple Estates. Inside the first vehicle, Vanessa sat quietly, scrolling through messages on her tablet. Her assistant, a young woman named Clara, sat beside her, reading out the updates. We've confirmed 2 residents are willing to give statements. One of them claims the HOA fined him for leaving his trash bin out 5 minutes too long. The other says they stopped her son from using the community park because of his noise level. Vanessa nodded. Good. Make sure they're ready to speak once we start. Back at Silver Maple, Rick's morning started like any other. He poured himself coffee, checked the weather, and tried not to think about yesterday. He told himself the woman probably wouldn't come back. Maybe she realized it was a misunderstanding. Maybe she'd go bother some other neighborhood. But when he stepped out of the booth and saw the line of dark SUVs approaching, his stomach dropped. He froze, coffee cup trembling in his hand. Oh, no, he muttered. The radios buzzed with chatter as other guards reported the sight. Multiple government vehicles inbound. It's her. She's back. Rick swallowed hard, straightened his shirt, and forced himself to stand at attention. The SUVs pulled up smoothly, engines humming. The lead car stopped right at the gate. The door opened, and Vanessa stepped out, wearing the same calm expression as before. She approached the booth slowly. Rick started to speak, but she held up a hand. No need for introductions. I remember you. Her tone wasn't cruel. It was simply factual, calm, firm enough to make him forget his words. He opened his mouth, trying to apologize, but nothing came out. She gave him a brief nod. Let's move forward from yesterday. Open the gate. He pressed the button without hesitation. As her convoy entered the neighborhood, curtains lifted and heads turned. People stood at their doors, whispering to one another. The sight of the official cars sent ripples through the quiet streets. By the time Vanessa reached the clubhouse, a small crowd had gathered at a distance, pretending to walk their dogs or check mailboxes. They wanted to see what was happening but didn't dare get too close. Inside the clubhouse, the board members were waiting, their faces pale and drawn. Karen stood at the head of the table again, her usual confidence now replaced by a tight-lipped unease. When Vanessa entered, everyone stood automatically, unsure of what to do. Good morning, Vanessa said, her voice steady but soft. Let's continue from where we left off. Karen forced a smile. Of course, Dr. Cole. We're ready to cooperate fully. The words sounded polite but carried the weight of fear. As Vanessa laid her folders on the table, the rain began tapping against the windows, a slow rhythm that filled the silence. She opened the first file. Before we begin, I'd like to address an incident that occurred at your gate yesterday. Rick shifted nervously in the corner, having been called in for the meeting. Your security staff detained me for over 20 minutes, made comments about my presence, and refused to verify my credentials. Is that standard procedure here? Karen's eyes darted toward Rick, her voice sharp. That was an unfortunate misunderstanding. I've already spoken to our staff. Vanessa looked at Rick. Do you have anything to add? He hesitated. I was following protocol. We're trained to question anyone not on the schedule. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. Including state officials. Rick's voice faltered. I didn't know. It won't happen again. She nodded once. I'm sure it won't. The board sat still as Vanessa began reviewing documents. The hours stretched, the tension thick. Every question she asked cut deeper than the last. Why did you approve a $40,000 landscaping project without competitive bidding? Why was a homeowner fined for hosting a family barbecue? Why did security issue 36 warnings to one resident for parking near her own home? Karen tried to defend each point, but the answers sounded weaker every time. We maintain standards, she insisted. Vanessa replied, standards don't mean control. They mean consistency. And what I see here is control without compassion. Outside, residents were beginning to gather under umbrellas, peering through the glass doors. They couldn't hear what was being said, but they could sense it. The air in the community felt different. The guards who once barked orders now stood silently, glancing nervously toward the officials. Rick remained by the wall, hands clasped behind his back, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to guilt. After several hours, Vanessa closed her folder. That's enough for today, she said quietly. We'll return tomorrow to speak with the residents. Karen exhaled with relief, but Vanessa wasn't finished. Before I leave, I'd like to say something. She looked around the table slowly. Communities are meant to protect the people who live in them, not punish them. What I saw at your gate was a reflection of everything wrong here. Power is easy to misuse when you think you'll never be questioned. But everything can be questioned. Even you. No one responded. The rain outside had stopped, but the silence inside the room felt heavier than thunder. Vanessa gathered her things, nodded politely, and walked to the door. As she stepped outside, the crowd of residents instinctively parted, watching her with curiosity and respect. Some even smiled. She nodded slightly, acknowledging them without words, then got into her car. Rick followed her out, his voice shaky. Dr. Cole, she paused, looking at him. Yes. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for yesterday. I didn't mean to disrespect you. She studied his face. He looked sincere, small in the shadow of everything that had unfolded. I know you didn't, she said softly. But remember this. Respect doesn't depend on who someone is. It depends on who you are. She turned, got into her car, and closed the door. As her convoy drove away, the residents began murmuring, excitement buzzing through the crowd. Some whispered words of hope. Others said it was about time someone stood up to the HOA. Rick stood in the drizzle, staring at the departing vehicles until they disappeared beyond the gate. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the one in control, and somehow, that felt right. Inside the clubhouse, Karen collapsed into her chair, pale and silent. The documents on the table looked like weapons pointed straight at her. One board member finally whispered, "She's not going away, is she?" Karen didn't answer. Her hands were trembling as she looked out the window at the departing SUVs. She had built this community on rules, on fear, on the idea that authority made her untouchable. But as she watched the cars vanish beyond the gates, she realized something that made her chest tighten. The same gates that had kept others out were now closing in on her. The rain began again, steady and soft, washing over the manicured lawns, the fences, the perfect mailboxes. The streets looked the same as always, but something in the air had changed. The neighbors felt it. The guards felt it. Even Karen felt it. And somewhere in the distance, driving toward the city lights, Vanessa Cole felt it too. The first cracks had appeared. The walls of arrogance were beginning to fall. But this was only the beginning. The real storm was still on its way. The morning after the audit, Silver Maple Estates looked calm from the outside, but inside every house, the tension was thick enough to feel. The streets were quiet, but not peaceful. They were waiting. Every porch conversation, every text between neighbors carried the same question. What was going to happen next? People who had spent years keeping their heads down suddenly felt something new, a sense that change might finally be coming. But inside the HOA clubhouse, that same feeling had turned into fear. Karen Holbrook sat at the long oak table, her hands folded tightly together, her nails digging into her palms. The blinds were closed even though sunlight was creeping around the edges. The rest of the board sat in stiff silence, eyes flicking between Karen and the stack of files Vanessa Cole had left behind. Nobody wanted to touch them. They sat like bombs in the middle of the table. "She's coming back," Karen said finally, her voice hoarse. "She said she'd be here again this morning." The others didn't respond. One of them, Mr. Crawford, cleared his throat softly. "Maybe we should just cooperate," he said carefully. "If we hand everything over, maybe the state will go easy on us." Karen snapped her head toward him, eyes blazing. "Go easy? Do you have any idea what's at stake? If those files go public, this neighborhood's reputation is destroyed. Our reputation is destroyed." The room fell silent again. Outside, the sound of sprinklers sputtering to life filled the silence like white noise. Karen stood abruptly, pacing. "We've kept this place running for 12 years. We built its value, we enforced order, we made sure people followed the rules. Now one woman walks in with a badge, and everyone's suddenly afraid of her." She stopped by the window and peeked through the blinds. "We can't let her control the story." The treasurer, a short man with nervous eyes named Peter, rubbed his hands together. "Karen, she has proof. Those documents she showed yesterday, those were our ledgers. You know how bad some of those numbers look." Karen turned sharply. "Then fix them. Do whatever it takes." Peter swallowed hard. "We can't fix missing money." Karen looked at him like a person realizing too late that she had surrounded herself with cowards. "Then start thinking of another way to protect what's left." She turned back toward the blinds, watching as two residents walked past outside, talking in hushed voices. "They're already whispering," she muttered. "Once the gossip starts, you can't stop it." At that moment, Rick entered the clubhouse, his posture stiff, hat in his hands. He said quietly, "She's back." The words hit the room like a gust of cold air. Everyone froze. Karen's eyes widened slightly. "Already?" Rick nodded. "She's at the gate with more vehicles. I think she brought people this time." Karen straightened her jacket, forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said, "Fine. Let's greet her properly this time." Outside, the quiet neighborhood watched as the black SUVs rolled through the open gate, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun. The sight of official vehicles sent a ripple through the streets. Residents stepped out onto porches, pretending to check their mail or water their plants, but their eyes followed the convoy. Even the kids on bicycles slowed down, sensing something important was happening. One elderly man standing by his lawnmower whispered to his wife, "I told you this HOA would get caught one day." Vanessa Cole's car led the convoy. She looked out the window as they passed house after house, all identical, all too neat, the kind of perfection that usually came with a price. She saw curtains move and silhouettes duck back out of sight. Fear always hid behind lace curtains, she thought. She had seen it before in other communities, the same story written in different streets. Power protected itself, right up until it couldn't. When the vehicle stopped outside the clubhouse, she stepped out, flanked by two assistants carrying document boxes. The sound of her heels against the stone steps echoed through the courtyard. Rick stood by the door, hat still in his hands, eyes lowered. "Good morning, Dr. Cole," he said softly. "Morning," she replied. "You've been briefed on what's happening today." He nodded quickly. "Yes, I've told all guards to stay clear." She gave him a small nod. "Good. Let's keep it that way." Inside, the board members scrambled to their feet as Vanessa entered. The tension in the room was immediate, thick, suffocating. Karen forced another strained smile. "Dr. Cole, welcome back. We've prepared the records you requested." Vanessa looked around the room, calm as ever. "Thank you. I hope everything is complete." She placed her folder on the table, opened it, and began laying out documents one by one. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that this review is being documented. Accuracy is important." Karen nodded stiffly, but her hands trembled as she slid a stack of papers toward Vanessa. "Here are our financial reports, as requested." Vanessa glanced through them quietly. Her assistant handed her another set of files. "Interesting," Vanessa murmured. "According to your own reports, Community maintenance costs have doubled in the past year, yet no new contractors were hired. She looked up slowly, meeting Karen's eyes. Would you like to explain that? Karen's throat tightened. We, had some unexpected repairs, storm damage, electrical updates. Vanessa interrupted gently. Storm damage? According to county weather records, there were no storms in this area last year. The room fell dead silent. Vanessa continued, her tone still even, but her words sharp. That means either your maintenance company misreported, or these funds were allocated somewhere else. I'll need the invoices for verification. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. I'll have my assistant find them, she said quickly. Please do, Vanessa replied. She set the papers aside, moving on. Now, about enforcement procedures. How does your HOA decide which violations are prioritized? The board exchanged uneasy glances. Peter, the treasurer, tried to answer. We rely on reports from residents and our security team. We just follow what the rules say. Vanessa nodded slowly. And yet, the majority of enforcement actions seem to target a small group of residents. Minor things, lawn length, mailbox color, decorative items. She turned another page, her tone soft but cutting. I see fines issued for a family that placed a holiday wreath outside their door. Another for parking a wheelchair-accessible van in a common area. Would you like to explain those? Karen started to speak, but Vanessa's voice overrode hers, still calm. Or perhaps it's easier to say you don't enforce equally. Outside, more residents were gathering near the clubhouse steps, their curiosity growing. Some carried folded letters, copies of fines they had received. A few recorded on their phones. For years, they had complained quietly, afraid of retaliation. Now they were watching the people who had intimidated them finally being questioned. Inside, Vanessa closed the file and looked at Karen directly. I'll be interviewing residents this afternoon. Anyone found to have been unfairly fined or harassed will be eligible for restitution under the state code. I suggest your board cooperates fully. Karen tried to smile again, but her voice cracked. Of course. Anything you need. Vanessa stood, her calm posture unbroken. Good. I'll be back at 2 o'clock. She gathered her papers, turned toward the door, then paused. And Karen, she said softly, when you run a community, remember, you work for them, not the other way around. She walked out, leaving the room frozen. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed like a verdict. Karen sank into her chair, pale and silent. The others looked at her, waiting for her to say something, but she couldn't find words. The image of Vanessa's calm face lingered in her mind, that quiet confidence, that unshakable authority. It was the kind of power Karen had always pretended to have. Outside, the residents stepped aside as Vanessa walked down the steps. A few smiled at her. One elderly man whispered, "Thank you." She nodded politely and continued toward her car. Rick stood nearby, watching her again, his respect growing with every step she took. He had once thought authority meant barking orders. Now, seeing her, he realized true authority was silent. It didn't need to shout to be heard. As Vanessa's car pulled away, the crowd began talking again, louder this time, no longer afraid. One woman said, "Maybe they'll finally listen to us." Another replied, "If she's really from the state, things are going to change." Back inside, Karen stood again, her voice shaking with anger. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I won't let her destroy what we built." Peter looked at her sadly. "Karen, what we built was already rotten. She's just showing everyone the cracks." Karen glared at him. "Then maybe I'll find a way to fix the cracks before she comes back." But as she looked down at the files on the table, numbers she couldn't explain, fines she couldn't justify, names she couldn't erase, even she knew it was too late. The foundation was already crumbling. By evening, the neighborhood was alive with whispers and new courage. People who had been afraid to speak now shared their stories. Small groups formed on porches and sidewalks, trading letters and old HOA warnings like pieces of evidence. Some even laughed, though it was nervous laughter, the sound of people realizing they weren't powerless anymore. Upstairs in her office, Karen stared out the window at the streetlights flickering on one by one. The perfect, spotless neighborhood she had controlled for over a decade suddenly felt unfamiliar. She could feel her power slipping through her fingers like sand. Somewhere out there, Vanessa Cole was preparing her next move, and Karen couldn't stop her. The night grew darker, and the rain started again, soft at first, then steady. The water slid down the windows of the clubhouse, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and gold. And in that quiet storm, Silver Maple Estates finally felt what it had never felt before: accountability. Vanessa's words echoed through every hallway, every street, every whisper between neighbors. You work for them, not the other way around. And though the HOA board still sat in their meeting room, pretending to plan their defense, deep down they knew the truth. The woman they had tried to dismiss had already taken control of their world. The panic had begun, and the real reckoning was still coming. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried that quiet heaviness that comes after a storm, a strange calm that never feels real. Silver Maple Estates woke up slower than usual. The lawns, usually buzzing with gardeners, were still wet and glistening. The mailboxes stood untouched. Even the birds seemed to hold back their songs. It was as if the whole community was holding its breath, waiting for something it didn't want to face. Inside the clubhouse, the board gathered again. Nobody spoke for the first 10 minutes. The only sound was the faint dripping of rainwater from the gutters outside. Karen Holbrook sat at the head of the table, her eyes shadowed from lack of sleep. The files Vanessa Cole had left yesterday were still spread across the table, pages curling at the corners. Every document was like a reminder that their little empire wasn't as perfect as they had told themselves. Finally, Peter, the treasurer, broke the silence. "She said she's coming back today," he murmured, his voice dry. "Do we even know who she really is?" Karen rubbed her temples. "She said she's from the State Oversight Division," she muttered. "That's all I know." Peter leaned forward, his tone low and nervous. "I checked last night. There's no public record of her being with that department. I searched every list, every database. No Dr. Vanessa Cole." Karen's eyes flickered up. "You're sure?" He nodded. "Completely. Either she's from a classified office, or she's someone much higher." For a few seconds, no one spoke. The idea that this calm, polite woman might be someone far beyond their reach sent a chill through the room. Karen looked toward the window, her reflection staring back at her in the glass. "Then who sent her?" she whispered. Meanwhile, across town, Vanessa stood in front of a mirror inside her small hotel room, adjusting the badge on her blazer. The morning light filtered through the curtains, soft and gray. She didn't look nervous, only focused, the way soldiers do before walking into battle. Her phone buzzed. "Agent Cole," said a voice on the other end. It was her division chief, a man named Warren who rarely called personally. The Attorney General's office approved the follow-up. "You're authorized to escalate if they resist cooperation." Vanessa nodded slightly. "Understood." Warren paused. "You're making progress." She looked out the window, where a silver-gray sky hung low over the city. "Progress is never loud," she said. "It's quiet until it hits." By the time she arrived at Silver Maple again, the clouds had started breaking apart. The sunlight came in streaks through the trees, lighting up the streets like a movie scene caught between peace and trouble. The guards at the gate didn't stop her this time. Rick opened the barrier himself, standing tall but respectful. He had ironed his uniform that morning, wanting to make up for his mistake. When Vanessa's car passed, he gave a small nod, the kind of nod soldiers give when they've learned humility. She acknowledged him with a faint glance, then drove in. As her car rolled through the neighborhood, she could feel eyes on her again. Curtains shifted, blinds twitched, whispers followed like wind. Word had spread that the woman from the state wasn't just auditing, she was exposing. People were beginning to wonder what else she might uncover. Inside the clubhouse, Karen's nerves were fraying. She had spent the entire morning combing through their financial ledgers, trying to cover gaps, erase trails, make sense of the mess they had created. But every time she tried to justify a missing expense, another hole appeared. It was like trying to stop a leak with her bare hands. Peter and the others sat around the table, waiting for her to speak, afraid to move. The door opened, and the sound of heels on the floor made everyone flinch. Vanessa walked in, calm as ever, carrying a black folder. "Good morning," she said softly. "Let's continue." The board stood awkwardly, mumbling greetings. Vanessa placed her folder on the table and opened it slowly. The papers inside were neatly arranged, tabbed with colored notes. "Yesterday, we discussed financial irregularities and selective enforcement," she said. "Today, I'd like to focus on correspondence between your board and the residents." Karen's stomach tightened. Vanessa continued, her tone steady but her words sharp. "Over the last year, your board sent over 100 violation letters. Many of them contain language that violates the state's Fair Housing and Anti-Harassment Code." She pulled out a few pages and began reading aloud. "Failure to comply with community standards will result in legal action and potential foreclosure." She set the page down, looking directly at Karen. "You threatened homeowners with foreclosure over lawn heights and mailbox colors. That's not just unethical, it's illegal." Karen's throat went dry. We were just enforcing the rules," she stammered. "These are standard forms." Vanessa raised her eyebrow. "Standard forms don't include racial undertones or phrases like, 'People like you lower the property value.' Would you like to explain who wrote those?" The room went dead silent. Peter looked down, avoiding her eyes. Another board member shifted uncomfortably. Karen felt heat rising in her face. "I don't know who typed those letters," she said weakly. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "You signed them, Ms. Holbrook." The air in the room seemed to vanish. Karen froze, staring at the signature line on the page. Her own name stared back at her like a ghost from the past. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to speak. "That must have been your signature," Vanessa interrupted calmly. "Yes, it was." Outside, a few residents had gathered again, standing quietly near the doors. Some carried envelopes, others just stood watching, sensing that something important was happening behind the walls. One of them whispered, "She's showing them the truth." Another replied, "About time someone did." Vanessa closed the folder, her voice still quiet but sharper now. "Ms. Holbrook, do you know why I came here?" Karen swallowed hard. "For an audit," she said weakly. Vanessa shook her head slowly. "No. I came here because of a child." The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. "A child?" Karen repeated, confused. Vanessa nodded. "A resident's daughter. She's 12. Your guards followed her home from the park last month because they said she didn't look like she belonged here. They demanded proof she lived in the neighborhood." Karen's face went pale. "That's not possible. We would never." Vanessa slid another file across the table. "Her parents filed a complaint with my department. They recorded the incident. I've heard the audio. The guards mentioned your name as the one who authorized random patrols for unrecognized individuals." The silence in the room was unbearable. Even the sound of the air conditioning seemed too loud. Karen sat back slowly, her expression breaking apart. I didn't know they would do that," she whispered. Vanessa looked at her steadily. "Yes, you did. You just didn't care who it hurt." Karen's lip trembled. "Who are you really?" she asked quietly. Vanessa's expression didn't change. "I told you," she said. "I'm with the State Oversight Division. But before that, I was a civil rights attorney. And before that, I was a kid who grew up in a neighborhood just like this one, where people smiled in public and judged in silence." For the first time, her voice carried something deeper, not anger, but memory. "I've seen what happens when power goes unchecked. I've seen families pushed out, elders humiliated, children treated like strangers in their own homes. So when I received the first complaint about Silver Maple Estates, I didn't assign it to someone else. I took it myself." Karen stared at her, her voice trembling. "You came here for revenge." Vanessa shook her head. No. I came for correction. Revenge changes nothing. But accountability? That builds something new. The room was completely still. Peter shifted uncomfortably, then whispered, "What happens now?" Vanessa gathered her files. "Now, I finish what I started. The full report will go to the Attorney General's office by the end of the week. State investigators will arrive soon to review your records and interview residents." She looked around the table one last time. "I suggest you prepare." As she turned to leave, Karen finally spoke again, her voice small and desperate. "Dr. Cole, please. I made mistakes, but I never meant for things to go this far." Vanessa paused at the door, her hand on the frame. "That's the problem," she said softly. "Nobody ever means to go that far. But silence and pride have a way of getting there on their own." Then she opened the door and stepped outside. The residents waiting near the steps turned as she appeared. Some smiled, others clapped quietly. Vanessa nodded politely, but her face stayed serious. She wasn't there for praise. She was there for truth. As she walked to her car, the sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time all day, washing the wet streets in gold. Children rode their bikes past the corner, laughing again, no longer watched by patrols. The air felt lighter. The fear that once ruled this neighborhood was starting to dissolve. Inside the clubhouse, Karen sat alone. The others had left. The sound of laughter outside felt like an insult. She reached for the file Vanessa had left behind and flipped through it again, her hands shaking. Every page told the same story, one she had written without realizing it. The numbers, the fines, the letters, all proof that the control she'd called order was really something else. Something ugly. She looked up at her reflection in the dark glass of the window and whispered, "Who am I, if not in control?" The reflection didn't answer. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting a soft glow across the lawns. The perfect symmetry of the neighborhood looked the same, but it wasn't. Not anymore. Something had changed. For the first time in years, the people who lived here weren't afraid of their board. And for the first time, the board was afraid of its people. As Vanessa's car turned out of the gates again, she looked back through the mirror one last time. Behind her, Silver Maple Estate stood silent, its fences glinting in the sun. Walls built to keep others out, now holding the guilty in. She whispered to herself, "The truth doesn't need permission to enter." And with that, she drove away, leaving behind a neighborhood that would never look at its own reflection the same way again. The next few days felt like years inside Silver Maple Estates. The calm that once defined the neighborhood was gone. You could see it in the way people looked out their windows now, in the way they spoke in low voices on sidewalks, and in the way every HOA board member avoided eye contact when they passed each other. The perfect lawns still shone under the morning sun, the sprinklers still ran on schedule, and the mailboxes still gleamed with fresh paint. But beneath that picture of order something was cracking. Fear had moved in quietly, replacing the false confidence that had ruled for so long. Every morning since Vanessa Cole's last visit, Karen Holbrook woke before dawn, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. She thought about every document she had signed, every email she had ignored, every time she had let her pride guide her instead of reason. For the first time in years, the Queen of Silver Maple Estates didn't feel in control. She sat at her desk surrounded by binders and receipts, red circles on every page showing numbers that didn't add up. She kept telling herself that she could fix it, that maybe this could still be buried, but deep down she knew, once Vanessa started digging, nothing stayed buried. Outside, the residents were beginning to see things differently too. The woman who lived 2 doors down from the clubhouse, Mrs. Rayner, who had been fined twice for excessive garden decor, now walked her dog past the HOA office with her head held high. The couple at the corner lot who had been warned for hosting too many visitors now waved to their neighbors without fear. People who used to avoid eye contact with the guards now greeted them boldly. It wasn't that they stopped following the rules. It was that they finally realized the rules weren't God's. Meanwhile, the HOA board was falling apart. Peter, the treasurer, looked 10 years older in just a week. He stayed late at the clubhouse every night, trying to balance the books that refused to balance. "We can't hide it anymore," he muttered one evening, his voice shaking. "She's going to find everything." Across the table, Karen's face was pale and drawn. "Then we find something on her," she snapped. But even as she said it, she knew it was desperate. "No one is untouchable," she said again. But her voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Peter looked at her sadly. "You still don't get it, do you? She's not here to destroy us, Karen. She's here because we already destroyed ourselves." That night, Karen sat alone in the empty clubhouse. The sound of the air conditioner filled the silence. Outside, rain began to fall again, soft but steady. She looked out through the glass doors and saw the reflection of the community she once ruled like a small empire. The neat lawns, the trimmed hedges, the perfect rows of mailboxes. It was still beautiful, but now she could see the cracks. The way people avoided her, the way the guards no longer saluted her, the way her own power had started to mean nothing. She whispered under her breath, it was supposed to be perfect. The next morning, 2 state investigators arrived. They weren't loud or dramatic. They just appeared, calm and professional, carrying briefcases and quiet authority. Rick was at the gate again, standing straighter this time. When he saw them, he opened the barrier without hesitation. "Good morning, sirs," he said, trying to sound respectful. One of the agents nodded. "We're here to continue Dr. Cole's audit." Rick nodded, his throat dry. "She's inside." He watched them drive in and felt that same cold wave in his stomach he'd felt the first day Vanessa came. But this time, it wasn't fear, it was respect. Inside the clubhouse, Karen was waiting with the rest of the board. Her hands were clasped tightly on the table as the investigators entered. Vanessa wasn't with them this time. She didn't need to be. Her name alone carried enough weight now to make everyone sit straight. The senior investigator, a calm man with gray hair, opened his folder and said in a flat, professional tone, "We'll be conducting interviews with residents and reviewing all HOA activity logs. Dr. Cole has submitted her preliminary findings, and they raise serious questions." Karen's throat tightened. Questions about what, exactly? The investigator looked up at her, his expression unreadable. About fairness, about discrimination, about misuse of authority, and possibly about funds. The words hit her like stones. She tried to smile. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said weakly. "We're a respected community." The man didn't smile. "Respect is earned," he said simply, and went back to his notes. By afternoon, the investigation had spread through the entire neighborhood like a quiet storm. Agents went door to door, speaking with residents, collecting documents, taking statements. Some people were nervous at first, whispering answers, afraid the board might find out. But when they realized the board had no power anymore, they spoke freely. Stories poured out, small stories that together painted a bigger picture. A man fined for hanging an American flag too early before a holiday. A mother harassed for letting her disabled son's ramp extend 2 inches into the sidewalk. A family nearly evicted over a broken fence panel during a storm. Every story carried the same echo: control, intimidation, and fear. As each interview ended, more neighbors came forward. By evening, people were lining up outside the clubhouse waiting to talk. The guards didn't interfere. They just stood quietly by, watching the same people they used to threaten now walk in with confidence. Rick leaned against the wall, arms crossed, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: relief. "About time someone cleaned this mess," he muttered. Inside, Karen sat at the end of the table while the investigators typed notes. Her once steady hands now trembled as she held a cup of coffee she didn't drink. She watched people coming and going through the glass doors. Neighbors she had fined, argued with, ignored. Now they wouldn't even look at her. She whispered to Peter, "They all hate me." Peter didn't respond. He just kept staring at the floor. The sun began to set, turning the sky orange and gold. Vanessa returned just before dark. Her car stopped outside the clubhouse, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. When she stepped out, the chatter in the crowd faded into quiet. She walked past the residence with the same calm grace as always, her folder under one arm, her steps measured and sure. Inside, the investigators stood as she entered. Karen couldn't bring herself to look at her. Vanessa placed her folder on the table. "The investigation is nearly complete," she said softly. "The evidence confirms patterns of misconduct. Multiple residents have reported financial and emotional harm." Karen finally looked up, her voice weak. "You've already made up your mind, haven't you?" Vanessa met her gaze. "The facts made up my mind." The silence that followed was heavier than any shouting could have been. The board members sat still, every sound magnified. The ticking of the clock, the soft hum of the lights, the rustle of papers as the investigators gathered their things. When Vanessa finally spoke again, her voice was almost gentle. "You built this place on control. But control is fragile. The moment people stop fearing you, it collapses. You don't have a community anymore, Ms. Holbrook. You have a cage." Karen's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She just whispered, "What happens now?" Vanessa stood straight. "Now you answer for it." She turned toward the door, paused, and said one last thing before leaving. "For years, people here lived under your rules. Now they'll live under fairness." When she stepped outside, the residents who had been waiting began to applaud softly. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the sound of quiet victory. Vanessa nodded slightly, got into her car, and drove off into the fading light. Inside, Karen sank back into her chair, her vision blurring. For the first time, she didn't see herself as the leader of Silver Maple Estates. She saw herself as part of the damage, another person blinded by pride, undone by the same power she once worshipped. The clubhouse around her felt smaller, colder, and quieter. Outside, the community she once ruled was finally breathing without her permission. Later that night, as the streetlights flickered on and the rain began again, the last files were boxed up and carried out by the investigators. Rick watched them go, his heart heavy but strangely peaceful. The truth was out now. There was no more pretending. And for the first time in a long while, Silver Maple Estates looked different. Not perfect, but honest. The houses still stood in their neat lines, the lawns still glowed green under the streetlights, but the fear that used to live behind every curtain was gone. It had been replaced by something stronger: courage. The next morning, the headlines would tell the story: State investigation exposes HOA misconduct in Silver Maple Estates. Reporters would call it shocking. Politicians would call it justice. But for the people who lived there, it would just be relief, the kind that came after years of being unheard. And for Karen Holbrook, sitting alone in her darkened office, staring at the reflection of her own face in the window, it would be something else entirely. The slow, painful realization that the empire she had built on fear had finally fallen, not with fire or noise, but with truth. And truth, once it started moving, could not be stopped. The storm had passed, but the air still felt heavy. Days after the investigation ended, Silver Maple Estates was no longer the same place. The manicured lawns were still there, the white fences still gleamed, and the mailboxes still stood perfectly straight, but something deeper had changed. The silence that once felt oppressive now carried something new: freedom. People spoke louder, smiled easier, and walked their streets without that constant fear of being watched. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive. The HOA office, once a place of command, had turned into a place of reckoning. Boxes of evidence were stacked along the walls, labeled and sealed. The boardroom that had been filled with authority and arrogance now felt hollow. The nameplates that once sat proudly on the table had been removed. The smell of old coffee and stress lingered in the air. Only Karen Holbrook remained, sitting by the window, her reflection blending with the gray light outside. For years, she had seen this office as her throne. Now, it felt like a prison. Across the street, residents gathered in small groups, talking about what had happened. Some were still in disbelief. "I can't believe she pulled it off," one man said. "I didn't think anyone could stand up to them." A woman replied softly. She didn't yell, didn't threaten. She just told the truth. That's what scared them most. People nodded. They had lived under the HOA's shadow for so long that peace itself felt strange, like stepping into sunlight after years underground. Rick, the head security guard, stood near the clubhouse steps, watching the crowd. His uniform looked the same, but his posture was different. The arrogance that once defined him was gone. In its place was something quieter: respect. He had been part of the problem for too long, but he was trying to make it right. When residents walked by, he nodded politely instead of barking orders. Some still ignored him, but others nodded back. It was a start. Inside the office, the door opened quietly. Vanessa Cole stepped in, her presence as calm and steady as always. She wasn't here to gloat or to intimidate. She was here to close the circle. Karen looked up from her desk, her eyes tired, her face pale. "You came," she said softly. Vanessa nodded. "I needed to make sure everything was settled." Karen let out a long breath. "Settled?" she repeated, almost to herself. "That's one word for it." Vanessa walked to the window, looking out at the street. Children were playing near the fountain, their laughter echoing through the air. "They seem happier," she said quietly. Karen's voice broke. "They should be. They finally got rid of me." Vanessa turned to her. "No, Karen. They got rid of fear." Karen's eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for it to become fear," she whispered. "I just wanted order. I wanted this place to look perfect, to feel safe." Vanessa's voice stayed calm. "Order without compassion becomes control. Safety without respect becomes tyranny. You didn't build a community, Karen, you built obedience. And that's why it fell apart." Karen looked down, her hands trembling slightly. "I know," she said. "I've had a lot of time to think about it. The investigators said I might lose my position, maybe face charges. I deserve that. But what hurts most is knowing that the people I thought I was protecting were the ones I was hurting." Vanessa didn't reply right away. She simply looked at her, her expression steady. "The state isn't here to destroy you. They're here to fix what was broken. Sometimes that means removing the people who built it wrong. But what you do now will decide whether you stay the villain in their memory or become part of the lesson." Karen looked up, surprised. "Do you really think that's possible? After everything I did?" Vanessa nodded slowly. "Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about recognition. You can't undo the past, but you can stop it from happening again." The room went quiet. Outside, a breeze moved through the trees, shaking loose the last few raindrops from the branches. Karen followed Vanessa's gaze, watching the children playing, the neighbors laughing. For the first time, she saw them not as rule breakers or problems to be managed, but as people, the very people she had failed to understand. A knock came at the door. Rick stepped in, holding a small box. He said to Vanessa. "The last of the files have been sealed for transfer." She nodded. "Thank you, Rick." He hesitated, then looked at Karen. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I'm sorry. For everything." Karen gave a small, sad smile. "So am I." Rick nodded once and left the room. Vanessa gathered her folder and turned to Karen. "The transition team will be here tomorrow. A new board will be formed, one chosen by the residents, not the old hierarchy. It's time they take ownership of their own home." Karen exhaled, the sound shaky but relieved. Maybe that's what it was supposed to be all along. Vanessa gave her a faint smile. It's what it should have been from the start. When Vanessa walked out of the office, the residents outside turned toward her. Some clapped softly, others just smiled. She nodded politely but didn't stop. She wasn't there for applause. She walked past the fountain, past the quiet rows of homes, past the same gate where it had all begun. Rick opened it for her, standing tall this time, not as a gatekeeper, but as a man who had learned respect. "Thank you," he said. She paused, looking at him for a long moment. "You're welcome, Rick. Keep it that way." Then she drove off, her car rolling down the same road where this story had started. But now the road felt different. The same place, but no longer the same world. That evening, the residents held a meeting at the park, the first open meeting in the history of Silver Maple Estates. No board members, no guards, no threats of fines. Just neighbors. They spoke about what they wanted for their future: transparency, fairness, kindness. They voted for a temporary council until elections could be held. For once, people who had never spoken to each other before sat side by side, laughing, sharing, rebuilding something that didn't need fences to feel safe. From her hotel balcony across town, Vanessa watched the sun set behind the hills. Her phone buzzed with a message from the state office: audit complete. Silver Maple placed under resident supervision. Excellent work, Cole. She set the phone down, took a sip of tea, and let out a slow breath. She didn't feel pride or victory, only calm. Justice wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, and patient. Just like truth. The next morning, headlines filled the news again. HOA scandal sparks reform movement. Residents take back their neighborhood. Across the state, other communities began filing complaints, inspired by what had happened in Silver Maple. Vanessa's report had become more than an investigation. It had become a message. Power built on fear never lasts. Weeks later, Silver Maple Estates elected a new board. The residents cheered as the results were announced in the park. Rick was appointed as Community Safety Coordinator, no longer a guard, but a helper, someone who looked out for others instead of policing them. The new board included people from every background, every age, and every corner of the neighborhood. For the first time, the rules weren't made to control, they were made to protect. And as life slowly returned to normal, the story of Dr. Vanessa Cole became a quiet legend. People still spoke of her, not with fear, but with respect. Children playing near the gate would point to the bronze plaque that the residents had placed there. A simple plate with 6 words engraved. Respect everyone. Justice begins with fairness. Karen still lived in the community, though she no longer held any title. She spent her days volunteering, planting flowers by the park, and helping clean up the clubhouse she once ruled. Some neighbors forgave her, others didn't. But she never complained. She knew forgiveness wasn't owed, it was earned, just like respect. One afternoon, months later, Vanessa drove past the neighborhood again. She didn't stop, didn't go inside. She only slowed down enough to see the children laughing near the fountain, the people talking by the lawns, and the guards greeting everyone with a smile. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Looks like they finally got it right." Then she drove away into the sunset, leaving behind the place that had taught everyone a lesson, including her. Silver Maple Estates wasn't perfect anymore. It didn't need to be. It was human now, flawed, learning, alive. And in that imperfection, it had finally found peace. Years later, the name Silver Maple Estates no longer made people think of fines and fear. The neighborhood had changed so completely that even the air felt different, lighter, freer. The lawns were still trimmed, the flowers still bright, the mailboxes still lined in perfect rows, but the perfection no longer came from control. It came from pride. People cared because they wanted to, not because someone was watching. On Saturday mornings, children rode their bikes past the fountain laughing, their voices echoing between the houses that had once been silent. The guards at the gate were friendly now, waving at families and helping new residents unload boxes. Nobody shouted orders anymore. The same gates that once kept people out now opened easily for everyone who called this place home. A small bronze plaque stood near the entrance where visitors could see it. It read, "Respect everyone. Justice begins with fairness." Below it were 2 names, Dr. Vanessa Cole and the residents of Silver Maple Estates. People touched the plaque when they passed, a quiet habit that had become almost sacred. Even those who had moved in long after the scandal knew the story. The older neighbors would tell it in soft voices on warm evenings. How a calm woman in a blue suit had walked through the gates one morning and turned an entire community inside out without ever raising her voice. They would tell their children that truth didn't need to shout, that fairness was stronger than fear, and that respect was the real rule of any neighborhood. Karen Holbrook still lived there. Her hair had turned gray, and the sharpness that once lived in her eyes had softened. She no longer sat behind an HOA desk or gave speeches about regulations. Instead, she spent her mornings tending to the flower beds by the park, kneeling in the dirt with her hands stained by soil instead of ink. The same people who once avoided her now stopped to chat. Some forgave her, some still didn't, but everyone respected the way she kept showing up, day after day, planting something beautiful where bitterness used to grow. Sometimes she would see children run past the clubhouse and smile faintly, remembering how cold that building had felt when she ruled it. She would whisper to herself, "We built fences when we should have built trust." Rick was still there too. He had stayed on after the transition, training new guards and teaching them what he called the first rule of the gate. When recruits asked what that was, he would answer simply, "Every person who drives through here deserves the same respect you'd give your own family." They listened, because they knew his story, and they knew he had learned that lesson the hard way. Residents who had once been afraid of security now stopped by the gate just to bring coffee or wave hello. Rick would smile each time, grateful that he'd lived long enough to see the place redeemed. Every year, on the anniversary of the investigation, the community held a gathering they called Fairness Day. It wasn't grand, no fireworks, no speeches, just a picnic at the park with food, music, and laughter. Families laid blankets on the grass, teenagers played guitars, and the older folks told stories about how things used to be. At sunset, someone would always read a short message written by Vanessa Cole herself. "Fairness is not a gift. It is a choice repeated every day until it becomes habit." When the reader finished, people would clap softly, the kind of applause that came from gratitude, not performance. Vanessa never returned officially, but sometimes her car was seen passing by on the highway that curved around the neighborhood. Once, early one morning, Karen thought she saw that same dark sedan slowing near the gate. She walked over, her heart beating faster, but by the time she reached the street, the car was already gone, leaving behind only the sound of its engine fading into the distance. Still, she smiled, knowing Vanessa didn't need to stop. She had already left her mark. Over time, the story of Silver Maple Estates spread far beyond the town. News programs turned it into documentaries. Community leaders quoted it in meetings. Other HOAs across the state began holding their own audits, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to prove they were transparent. The Cole Principle became part of the state's housing training manual, a simple rule printed on the first page: power means responsibility, not control. Vanessa's quiet work had changed more than one neighborhood. It had changed the way people thought about community itself. 10 years after the investigation, the residents decided to build a small memorial garden behind the clubhouse. They planted white lilies for peace and blue hydrangeas for trust. In the center stood a bench with an inscription, "To those who chose truth over silence." On summer evenings, people sat there to watch the sunset, and sometimes Karen would join them, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes following the sky as it turned gold and pink. She liked to think that somewhere, Vanessa was watching the same sunset, feeling the same peace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, a young woman in a navy blue jacket walked up to the garden carrying a file folder. She was new to the community, a law student who had just bought a small house with her husband. She placed the folder on the bench and whispered, "Thank you." Inside the folder was a letter addressed to Dr. Vanessa Cole. It said, "I'm joining the State Oversight Division next month. Your story is the reason I chose this path." She smiled softly, closed the folder, and left it there under the bronze plaque where others would find it. That night, a gentle breeze moved through the trees, rustling the flowers and making the water in the fountain ripple. The lights from the houses glowed warm and steady, reflections dancing on the puddles left by a light rain. Somewhere far away, a phone buzzed on a hotel nightstand. Vanessa picked it up, saw the message from an old colleague. "Thought you should know. Another young lawyer joined because of Silver Maple. The work continues." She smiled, set the phone down, and looked out the window at the distant lights of the city. She thought of that first day at the gate, Rick's suspicion, the crowd stares, the arrogance she had faced. It felt like a lifetime ago. She had never sought fame or credit. All she had wanted was to remind people that fairness wasn't weakness, that respect wasn't optional, and that kindness was the truest form of strength. She whispered to herself, "That's all I ever wanted them to learn." As the night deepened, the quiet streets of Silver Maple Estates glowed softly under the streetlights. The laughter of children drifted through open windows, mixing with the hum of crickets and the faint splash of the fountain. The neighborhood no longer needed guards to keep it safe. It was safe because the people inside it finally understood what community meant. Years later, long after Vanessa was gone, a local teacher brought her class to the garden for a history lesson. The children gathered around the plaque, tracing the engraved words with small fingers. One asked, "Who was she?" The teacher smiled. "She was the woman who taught an entire town what respect really means." The children nodded, their eyes wide, and one of them said quietly, "Then we should always be like her." The teacher nodded. "That's the point." And as the sun rose higher over Silver Maple Estates, the gold light touched every rooftop, every window, every flower blooming by the path. The once feared gate stood open, its metal polished by time and weather, welcoming everyone without question. The fountain sparkled, the air smelled of rain and grass, and the words on the plaque gleamed brighter than ever. "Respect everyone. Justice begins with fairness." The story of Silver Maple became legend not because of its fall, but because of its rise, the way people learned to heal, to forgive, and to live side by side without fear. And though the world moved on, somewhere in the quiet rhythm of everyday life, the spirit of Vanessa Cole still lingered. In every act of kindness, in every fair decision, in every voice that chose truth over silence. Because some stories don't end. They echo. They grow roots. They become the soil that future generations stand on. And in the soft wind that passed through the open gates of Silver Maple Estates, it almost sounded like a whisper, gentle but unending, "Respect everyone."